Welcome, and thank you for joining me. Fall means different things to a lot of us, but most can agree that curling up with a good book is a favorite fall activity. For over a decade each November, the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula hosts a huge book sale to raise funding for all the important educational programs and ways the museum connects to our community. But this year, the book sale, like many events, is quite different. So in the spirit of pivoting and playing the hand we've got, your museum team has decided to bring the books to you virtually with an online book sale. And to make it fun for all of us missing the sale, we will be reading you some of our favorite finds from the book sale and beyond. So please relax and enjoy and support the cause by heading over to fortmissoulamuseum.org to support history by buying books. That's fortmissoulamuseum.org. Today I'm reading you one of my personal favorites. It's The Fellowship of the Ring. It is the first in J.R.R. Tolkien's famous fantasy trilogy, The Lord of the Rings. I'll be reading from the prologue instead of any of the main chapters, simply because the prologue is one of the only places in all of Tolkien's work that gives us insights into those merry folks, the Hobbits. I hope you enjoy my reading, and I hope you'll take some time to check out the museum's online book sale to find a book you love. Learn more at fortmissoulamuseum.org. One more time, that is fortmissoulamuseum.org. Prologue 1. Concerning Hobbits. This book is largely concerned with hobbits, and from its pages, a reader may discover much of their character and a little of their history. Further information will also be found in the selection from the Red Book of the West March that has already been published under the title The Hobbit. That story was derived from the earlier chapters of the Red Book, composed by Bilbo himself, the first hobbit to become famous in the world at large and called by him There and Back Again, since they told us of his journey into the East and his return, an adventure which later involved all the hobbits in the great events of that age that are here related. Many, however, may wish to know more about this remarkable people from the outset, while some may not possess the earlier book. For such readers, a few notes on the more important points are here collected from Hobbit lore, and the first adventure is briefly recalled. Hobbits are an unobtrusive but very ancient people, more numerous formerly than they are today, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not, and did not, understand or like machines more complicated than forge bellows, a watermill, or a hand-loom, though they were skillful with tools. Even in ancient days they were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They are quick of hearing and sharp-eyed, and though they are inclined to be fat and do not hurry unnecessarily, they are nonetheless nimble and deft in their movements. They possessed from the first art of disappearing, swiftly and silently, when large folk whom they did not wish to meet come blundering by. In this art they have developed, until to men it may seem magical. But hobbits have never, in fact, studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to professional skill that heredity and practice, and a close friendship with the earth, have rendered inimitable by larger and clumsier races. For they are little people, smaller than dwarves, less stout and stocky, that is, even when they are not actually much shorter. Their height is variable, ranging from 2 and 4 feet of our measure. They seldom now reach 3 feet, but they have dwindled, they say. In ancient days, they were taller. According to the Red Book, Bandabras Took, Bull Roarer, son of Insengrim II, was 4'5" and able to ride a horse. He was surpassed in all Hobbit records by only 2 famous characters of old, but that curious matter is dealt with in this book. As for Hobbits of the Shire, with whom these tales are concerned, in the days of their peace and prosperity they were a merry folk. They dressed in bright colors, being notably fond of yellows and greens, but they seldom wore shoes, since their feet had tough leathery soles and were clad in thick curling hair, much like the hair of their heads, which was commonly brown. Thus, the only craft little practiced amongst them was shoemaking, but they had long and skillful fingers, and could make many other useful and comely things. Their faces were as a rule good-natured rather than beautiful. Broad, bright-eyed, red-cheeked with mouths apt to laughter and to eating and drinking. And laugh they did, and eat, and drink, often and heartily, being fond of simple jests at all times, and of 6 meals a day, when they could get them. They were hospitable and delighted in parties, and in presents which they gave away freely and eagerly accepted. It is plain indeed that in spite of later estrangement, hobbits are relatives of ours, far nearer to us than elves, or even than dwarves. Of old they spoke the languages of men, after their own fashion, and liked and disliked some of the same things men did. But what exactly our relationship is can no longer be discovered. The beginning of hobbits lies far back in the elder days that are now lost and forgotten. Only the elves still preserve any records of that vanished time, and their traditions are concerned almost entirely with their own history, in which men appear seldom and hobbits are not mentioned at all. Yet it is clear that hobbits had, in fact, lived quietly in Middle-earth for many long years before other folk became even aware of them. And the world being, after all, full of strange creatures beyond count, these little people seemed of very little importance. But in the days of Bilbo and of Frodo his heir, they became, by no wish of their own, both important and renowned, and troubled the counsels of the wise and the great. Those days, the third age of Middle-earth, are now long past, and the shape of all lands has changed. But the regions in which the hobbits lived then were doubtless the same as those in which they still linger, the northwest of the Old World, east of the sea. Of the original home of the hobbits in Bilbo's time preserved no knowledge. A love of learning, other than genealogical lore, was far from general among them, but there were still remained a few in the order of families who studied their own books and even gathered reports of old times and distant lands from elves, dwarves, and men. Their own records began only after the settlement of the Shire, and their most ancient legends hardly looked further back than the wandering days. It is clear nonetheless that from these legends and from the evidence of their peculiar works and customs that, like many other folk, hobbits had in the distant past moved westward. The earliest tales seem to glimpse a time when they dwelt in the upper vales of Anduin, between the eaves of Greenwood the Great and the Misty Mountains. Why they later undertook the hard and perilous crossing of the mountains into Eriador is no longer certain. Their own accounts speak of the multiplying of men in the land, and of a shadow that fell in the forest, so that it became darkened, and its new name was Mirkwood. Before crossing of the mountains, the hobbits had already become divided into 3 somewhat different breeds: Harfoot, Stoors, and Fallowhides. The Harfoots were browner of skin, smaller and shorter, and they were beardless and bootless. Their hands and feet were neat and nimble, and they preferred highlands and hillsides. The Stoors were broader, heavier in build, their feet and hands were larger, and they preferred flat rivers and lands. The Fallowhides were fairer of skin, and also of hair, and they were taller and slimmer than the others, and were the lovers of trees and of woodlands. The Harfoots had much to do with dwarves in ancient times, and long lived in the foothills of the mountains. They moved westward early, and roamed over Eriador as far as Weathertop, while the others were still in the wilder land. They were the most normal and representative variety of hobbit, and far the most numerous. They were the most inclined to settle in one place, the longest preserved in their ancestral habit of living in tunnels and holes. The Stoors lingered long by the banks of the great river Anduin, and were less shy of men. They came west after the Harfoots followed the course of the Loudwater southwards, and there were many of them long dwelt between Tharbad and the borders of Dunland before they moved north again. The Fallowhides, the least numerous, were a northerly branch. They were more friendly with the elves than other hobbits were, and had more skill in language and song than in handicrafts, and of old they preferred hunting to tilling. They crossed the mountains north of Rivendell and came down the river Horwell. In Eriador, they soon mingled with other kinds that had preceded them, but being somewhat bolder and more adventurous, they were often found as leaders or chieftains among clans of Harfoots or Stoors. Even in Bilbo's time, The strong Falahitish strain could still be noted amongst the greater families, such as the Tooks and the Masters of Buckland. In the westlands of Eriador, between the Misty Mountains and the Mountains of Lune, the hobbits found both men and elves. Indeed, a remnant still dwelt there of the Dunedain, the kings of men that came over the sea out of Westerness, but they were dwindling fast, and the lands of their north kingdom were falling and wide to waste. There was room and to spare for incomers, and ere long the hobbits began to settle in ordered communities. Most of their earlier settlements had long disappeared and been forgotten by Bilbo's time, but one of the first to become important and still endured, though reduced in size, was that at Bree, in the Chetwood that lay out around about some 40 miles east of the Shire. It was in these early days that the hobbits learned their letters and began to write in the manner of the Dunedain, who had in their long before learned the art from the elves. And in those days also they forgot whatever languages they had used before, and spoke ever after the common speech, the Westron as it was named, that was current through all the lands of the kings from Arnor to Gondor, and about all the coasts of the sea from Belfalas to Lune. Yet they kept a few words of their own, as well as some of their own names of months and days, and a great store of personal names about the past. About this time, legend among the hobbits first becomes history with a reckoning of years, for it was in the 1601st year of the Great Age that the Fallowhide brothers, Marcho and Blanco, set out from Bree, having obtained permission from the High King at Fornost. They crossed the Brown River Barandween with a great following of hobbits. They passed over the bridge of stone bows that they had built in the days of power of the North Kingdom, and they took all the land beyond to dwell in, between the river and the far downs. All that was demanded of them was that they should keep the great bridge in repair, and all other bridges and roads, speed the king's messengers, and acknowledge his lordship. Thus began the Shire reckoning, for the year of the crossing of the Brandy Book, as the hobbits turned the name, became year 1 of the Shire, and all later dates were reckoned from it. At once the hobbits fell in love with their new land, and they remained there, soon passed once more out of history of men and elves. While there was still a king, they were in name his subjects, but they were, in fact, ruled by their own chieftains, and meddled not at all with events in the world outside. To the last battle at Fornost, with the Witch Lord of Angmar, they sent some bowmen to the aid of the king, or so they maintained, though no tales of men recorded. But in that northern kingdom ended, and then the hobbits took the land for their own, and they chose from their chieftains a thane to hold the authority of the king that was gone. There for 1,000 years they were little troubled by wars, and they prospered and multiplied after the Dark Plague, until the disaster of the long winter and the famine that followed it. Many thousands perished, but the days of the dearth were at the time of this tale long past, and the hobbits had again become accustomed to plenty. The land was rich and kindly, and though it had been deserted when they entered it, it had before been well tilled, and there the king once had many farms, cornlands, vineyards, and woods. 40 leagues it stretched from the far downs to the Brandywine Bridge, and 50 from the northern moors to the marshes of the south. The hobbits named it the Shire, as the region of the authority of their thane, and a district of well-ordered business. And there, in that pleasant order of the world, they plied their well-ordered business of living, and they heeded less and less to the world outside, where dark things moved, until they came to think that peace and plenty were the rule in Middle-earth, and the right of all sensible folk. They forgot or ignored what little they had ever known of the Guardians, and of the labors of those that made possible the long peace of the Shire. They were in fact sheltered, but they had ceased to remember it. At no time had hobbits of any kind been warlike, and they had never fought amongst themselves. In olden days they had, of course, been often obliged to fight to maintain themselves in a hard world, but in Bilbo's time that was very ancient history. The last battle, before this story opens, and indeed the only one that had ever been fought within the borders of the Shire, was beyond living memory. The battles of the Green Fields, in which Bandabras took routed an invasion of orcs. Even the weathers had grown milder, and the wolves that had once come ravening out of the north in bitter white winters were now only a grandfather's tale. So, though there was still some store of weapons in the Shire, they were used mostly as trophies, hanging above hearths or walls, or gathered in the museum at Michael Delving. The Matham House, it was called, for anything that hobbits had no immediate use for, they were unwilling to throw away, they called a Matham. Their dwellings were apt to become rather crowded with Mathams, and many of their presents had passed from hand to hand were of that sort. Nonetheless, ease and peace had left this people still curiously tough. They were, if it came to it, difficult to daunt or kill, and they were, perhaps, so unwearingly fond of good things, not least they could, when put to it, do without them, and could survive rough handling by grief, foe, or weather in a way that astonished those who did not know them well and looked no further than their bellies and well-fed faces. Though slow to quarrel, and for sport killing nothing that lived, they were doughty at bay, and at need could still handle arms. They shot well with the bow, for they were keen-eyed and sure at the mark. Not only with bows and arrows. If any hobbit stooped for a stone, it was well to get quickly under cover, as all trespassing beasts knew very well. All hobbits had originally lived in holes in the ground, or so they believed, and in such dwellings they still felt most at home, but in the course of time they had actually been obliged to adopt other forms of abode. Actually, in the Shire, in Bilbo's days it was, as a rule, only the richest and poorest of hobbits maintained the old custom. The poorest went on living in burrows of the most primitive kind, near holes indeed, with only one window or none, while the well-to-do still constructed more luxurious versions of the simple diggings of old. But suitable sites for such large and ramifying tunnels, or smiles as they had called them, were not everywhere to be found, and in the flats and the low-lying districts of the hobbits, as they multiplied, began to build above ground. Indeed, even in the hilly regions and the older villages, such as Hobbiton or Tuckborough, or in the chief township of the Shire, Michael Delving, on the White Downs, there were now many houses of wood, brick, or stone. These were specifically favored by millers, smiths, ropers, and cartwrights, and others of that sort, for even they had holes to live in. Hobbits had long been accustomed to building sheds and workshops. The habit of building farmhouses and barns was said to have begun among the inhabitants of the Marish town by the Brandywine. The hobbits of that quarter, the East Farthing, were rather large and heavy-legged, and they wore dwarf boots in muddy weather. But they were well known to the Stoors, in large part of their blood, as indeed was shown by the down that grew in their chins. No Harfoot or Fallowhide of any race had a beard. Indeed, the folk of the Marish and of Buckland, east of the river, in which they afterwards occupied, came for the most part later to the Shire, from up south away, and they still had many peculiar names and strange words not found elsewhere in the Shire. It is probable that the craft of building, as many other crafts beside, was derived from the Dunedain, but the hobbits may have learned it direct from the elves, the teachers of men in their youth. For the elves of the high kindred had not yet forsaken Middle-earth, and they dwelt still at the time in the Grey Havens to the west, and in other places within reach of the Shire. 3 elf towers of immemorial age were still seen to the tower hills beyond the western marches. They shone far off in the moonlight. The tallest was furthest away, standing alone upon a green mound. The hobbits of the West Farthing said one could be seen from the sea atop that tower, but no hobbit had ever been known to climb it. Indeed, few hobbits had ever seen or sailed upon the sea, and fewer still had ever returned to report it. Most hobbits regarded even rivers and small boats as deep misgivings, and not many of them could swim. And as the days of the Shire lengthened, they spoke less and less with the elves and grew afraid of them, and distrustful of those that had dealings with them, and the sea became a word of fear among them. and a token of death, and they turned their faces away from the hills in the west. The craft of building may have come from elves or men, but the hobbits used it in their own fashion. They did not go in for towers. Their houses were usually long, low, and comfortable. The oldest kind were, indeed, no more than built imitations of smiles, thatched with dry grass or straw, or roofed with turves, and having walls that somewhat bulged. That stage, however, belonged to the early days of the Shire, and hobbit building had long since been altered, improved by devices learned from dwarves or discovered by themselves. A preference for round windows and even round doors was the chief remaining peculiarity of hobbit architecture. The houses and holes of the hobbits were often large and inhabited by large families. Bilbo and Frodo Baggins were, as bachelors, very exceptional, as they also had in many other ways, such as their friendship with the elves. Sometimes, in the case of the Tooks of the Great Smiles or the Brandy Bucks of Brandy Hall, many generations of relatives lived in peace together in one ancestral and many-tunneled mansion. All hobbits were, in any case, clannish and reckoned up by their relationships with great care. They drew long and elaborate family trees with innumerable branches. In dealing with hobbits, it is important to remember who it is related to whom and in what degree. It would be impossible in this book to set out a family tree that included even the more important members of the more important families at the time at which these tales tell of. The genealogical trees at the end of the Red Book of the West March are a small book in themselves, and all but hobbits would find them exceedingly dull. Hobbits delighted in such things, if they were accurate. They liked to have books filled with things that they already knew, set out fair and square, with no contradictions. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you enjoyed this reading. And thank you for being part of the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula's first ever virtual book sale. If you enjoyed this reading and are inspired, find a new book for you or your family and friends this holiday season. Check out one of our literary treasures to be found online at fortmissoulamuseum.org/virtual book sale. Again, that's fortmissoulamuseum.org/virtual book sale. Thank you.